So I have a copy of God, A Human History by Reza Aslan, and I thought we could have a little bit of a discussion on some of the things that are in the book. For example, in his section called The Lord of Beasts, this is on page 26, he discusses supernaturalism, and I thought that it was just very interesting to hear how the term supernatural has evolved over the decades, the centuries, and just really into the present day. For example, he writes, "The British ethnologist Robert Merritt termed this feeling of wonderment supernaturalism, the attitude of mind dictated by awe of the mysterious. Merritt argued that ancient human beings believed in an invisible force, a kind of universal soul that lay just behind the visible world. He called this force mana, an old Polynesian word meaning power." Well, absolutely fascinating to hear something like that, because in our contemporary lexicon, we really refer to supernatural as above nature, something that, is greater than nature. It can be written supernatural, supranatural, and it's a very fascinating thing to discuss, because I've been a long believer I guess the camp of Guy Lyon Playfair, who said something better than I ever could when he was like, it's not supernatural if it exists in the natural world. It's just misunderstood. What I used to say was that something can't be above nature. I mean, it's just an additional part of nature that hasn't been evaluated yet. And that's exactly sort of what Guy Lyon Playfair, who wrote a couple books about this back in the 70s, but he became famous in Britain for a few things later on in life. But he definitely explored this subject back in his writings in the late 1970s. So the thing is, though, is this stuff here is kind of talking about something that really would be kind of beyond nature. But the problem is, though, for starters, it really feels like this ethnologist that Reza Aslan is talking about, Robert Merritt, it seems like he's more describing just what we refer to as mysticism. It's just what we refer to as kind of the mystic experience as opposed to a supernatural one. I would still say that when many people are using the word supernatural in our daily life, it's mostly they refer to something that is above nature. And I really could not agree more with Playfair, who is just it's not supernatural if it exists in the natural world, it's just misunderstood. Well, the interesting thing is, we have some other things that are going on here. In this little paragraph, we also have, that it's the universal soul that lay just behind the visible world. Would that challenge something that is put forth by Playfair? That, is this something that is not existing in the natural world? Well, I really think we have to put the two statements, Playfair's and that other one that I mentioned, together and recognize that nature is the totality of all existing processes. If someone ever refers to something as supernatural, they're kind of just making the assumption that it does not exist. And I think that this is done with somewhat of an intention, and as language has evolved over time, we are recognizing that a lot of people probably are kind of coming at it from that particular very slanted issue, that to say that, something is supernatural, they're kind of just basing it on the assumption that it doesn't exist, whether they're talking about ghosts, or if they want to include things like UFOs are often incorporated into discussions about supernaturalism. But in reality, supernatural is just something that should not exist in the English language. It's one of those terms where it's it's just kind of a misnomer. It incorrectly labels something. And, it's when we have something here talking about this universal soul, that is definitely more of a mystic idea as opposed to a supernatural one. And mysticism is also another term that is used very poorly, because when they start referring to things like mystics, when they refer to people as mystics, I should say, it kind of has this kind of very, very whimsical connotation where it's sort of like they're equating it with magic, and it's almost like it's definitely going to be conflated with sort of magical thinking. But Plato was a mystic. Perhaps Gottfried Leibniz would fall into the category of being a mystic. Ludwig von Mises is often referred to as a mystic thinker. But in reality, we can also just kind of view them as sort of people who are trying to bridge the gap between ideas and natural science, if that's really what you call mystics. I mean, like, I would say that many of us are mystic indeed. But when we look at this thing that the attitude of mind dictated by the awe of the mysterious, Einstein did not refer to that as anything associated with being, he didn't, as far as I know, he didn't refer to that as supernatural, but Einstein really wrote enormous amounts of books. I haven't read through every single word that Einstein ever wrote, but what Einstein referred to himself as, he referred to himself as a cosmic spiritualist. So it's like, that definitely sounds like you're talking about something that is associated more with cosmic spiritualism as opposed to supernaturalism. And Einstein is very precise that he was more in the tradition of Baruch Spinoza, that there is some sort of kind of marvelous awe and wonder of the universe that is only within the universe, that is only within nature. Einstein was not about anything being above nature, and he definitely wasn't about this sort of thing that lay beyond or behind the visible world. I don't, as far as I know from my kind of limited understanding of his writings, he was more just about that there is a certain element in nature that he believed was spiritual. And once again, it's like he's coming at it from, I think, perhaps a more legitimate standpoint when he's looking at it from this kind of way that there is something that is greater than just matter and energy. Because, of course, Einstein was first and foremost a physicist. But to say that, that there a universal soul? This is a very good question. And the most honest answer that I can give you is, I don't know. But I guess a more satisfying one is that what we can say is what some people refer to as this quote-unquote universal soul is something that is like, there are definitely things that we can observe and understand and follow in a logical sequence and perhaps even comprehend with a certain amount of empiricism. That when people talk about spirituality, we talked about Einstein and the cosmic spirituality, and we also talked about other things such as, monism, Gaiaism, pantheism. A lot of these things that claim to be spiritual have a certain element of kind of empirical value to them, and even if you can't experience it with your five senses, you could follow what someone is saying in a logical sequence, and it's very difficult to often say that it does not exist. But Reza Aslan continues here when he says, whether it was in dreams or in the encounter with nature or in speculations about departed ancestors, what all of these explanations have in common is the assumption that religion arose in human evolution to answer unanswerable questions and to help early humans manage a threatening and unpredictable world. It is an explanation for religious experience that remains popular to this day. Well, Reza Aslan is, of course, somebody who is kind of a challenger of that theory, which he really says, in a lot of his public appearances, that it's not only that these things just came up because of human evolution, that these things just came up because of the development of society. What I believe Reza Aslan really likes to say, and he talks about this later on in the book God, but I've done a separate upload entirely on that stuff. I was really wanted to talk more about the supernatural today and the term supernaturalism and how it's kind of a misnomer of the English language. But what he says here is that, I believe Reza Aslan says that there is, a certain existential quality to all of these things that is being put forward. Other people like Jordan Peterson have also said very similar things, like there is a definition of morality, or there's a definition of the truth that draws people toward morality, that these things aren't based on nothingness. And that's something that those two have in common. They're really saying that these sort of quote-unquote religious traditions are not based on nothingness. And Reza Aslan is also talked about during his debate with Sam Harris, that he was saying that he was hoping in the future that people would recognize that something like physics or something like cosmology, the science, the actual science of cosmology as opposed to the stories, could be used as kind of a way that people try to comprehend that, whatever that may be, like the people could use, physics and cosmology as the new language by which religion is transmitted, and perhaps we'll experience a more qualitative world. But a lot of people, and I do have to stress, a lot of people are really in the camp that these things are not just baseless. They're not just sort of people came up with these stories because they didn't understand what was going on. There apparently is a little bit more to the equation. And I don't think that this is some blown out, extremely complex or distorted answer. I really think that this is actually much simpler than people take on. Perhaps, we've talked about that one sentence, there's a definition of truth that draws people toward morality. And there are, other psychologists like Dr. Michael Shermer who just say that the collective happiness of humanity is what drives a civilization forward. Like when people are sharing, collective happiness, that's what will create. That's what allows a civilization to prosper, and that's all there is. But Michael Shermer is also someone who concluded that same presentation by saying that he is free from God, but not the God of nature. So at the same time, he's kind of somewhat aware of these things that are going on. And I think that a lot of people are recognizing in the 21st century that this very commonly held belief that all of religion in its entirety, no matter how many religions the world, over 4,200 are still currently practiced today, are not only about people just not having answers to things, so they came up with stories. And even when we have here, whether it was in our dreams or in the encounters with nature or in speculations about departed ancestors, well, a lot of people not only have this giant question, what happens after you die, it's also something about people want to live at peace. And that's what these sort of religious traditions and religious stories are all talking about with an afterlife, whether it's ancient Egypt or whether it's Judeo-Christianity, Islam, whatever you would like to say. They're sort of talking about this because it creates a larger sense of optimism for a civilization, and it gives people, a positive, forward-thinking worldview, and it gives them something to look forward to. Whereas, there are many critics to that. Sam Harris says that a belief in paradise is horribly detrimental because it makes people think that this life we have here is meaningless, so therefore destruction is permitted. And there's a fair case to be made for certain things like that. But really the answer is, for someone like Sam Harris, you would really want to say that the real challenge is just to remove the destruction. And that's why, but in all reality, Sam Harris isn't too different from Reza Aslan. Sam Harris, during, his debate with Reza Aslan, he said very clearly that he wanted scientists to become more mystic. He wanted mystic scientists, whereas Reza Aslan said he wanted religious scientists, in a very, very loose sense, the way we talked about earlier about using physics and cosmology as the language by which people would understand the kind of the mysteries of the universe. The miraculous awe-and-wonder experience of the universe would be done through physics and cosmology as opposed to religious stories, whereas, Sam Harris is just sort of saying something very similar to that, except he calls it he more uses words like mysticism. Reza Aslan continues by saying, "There's no doubt that for a great many people, religion helps make sense of a mystifying and volatile existence. The question is, what, if any, adaptive advantage that would have provided primitive human beings in their early development? How exactly does offering soothing yet ever-shifting answers to the mysteries of the universe support the survival of the species?" Well, that's a very big question. And let's read it one more time. How exactly does offering soothing yet ever-shifting answers to the mysteries of the universe support the survival of the species? Well, we talked about some very big things. It gives people a sense of optimism to believe in an afterlife, and it also gives people a sense of optimism to believe that there actually is this definition of goodness and morality that they can follow. Granted, not all spiritual people believe that, but that does give people some things. But what a lot of people don't seem to recognize, and I've never heard any other critic or commentator ever come at it from this particular perspective, but what we could examine with that is we could say something to the effect of, like these things, these traditions, if you want to call them that, actually keep people somewhat in order, and it removes an enormous amount of destruction. And people are often trying to conflate that with people who are spiritual are ignorant, looking at many countries in the third world, the developing world, whatever you'd like to call it, and they're saying that their people are following these things because they're ignorant and uneducated. Well, why don't you look at it in more of an optimistic sense, that is one of the only forms of joy that they can have in their life, and that actually brings structure and order to very, very, impoverished societies, and thus in turn it creates kind of a more peaceful and organized society. Without that, particular structure, it would be much more chaotic. I've never heard any other commentator ever discuss anything like that, so I'm not really sure what to say about it. But when we want to go back to supernaturalism, are any of these belief systems supernatural? I mean, I would say no, absolutely not. Supernatural is a flawed term. It's not really accurate. And I don't believe most people are using supernatural the way the British ethnologist Robert Merritt would have. Because, I mean, like, it sounds like he's somewhat of the originator of this term in more of a classical sense, but a lot of our language evolves. The attitude of the mind dictated by the awe of the mysterious. Well, it's just like, that's not supernatural, though. That's not, anything that is above nature. What that really is, what he's really talking about is, once again, mystic and cosmic spiritual. But, when we actually want to examine, like, what is supernatural? Well, if it cannot be above nature, because it cannot be above the totality of all processes that are in existence. Furthermore, I mean, if it's connected in any way to the natural world, if you have the ability to perceive it when you're in the natural world as presented by Guyla and Playfair, then it's just something that is either misunderstood or you haven't completely evaluated it yet, or, it's like, why can't people, just sort of recognize this? I mean, both Sam Harris and Reza Aslan were in consensus that, through science we might understand whatever it is that, Robert Merritt is talking about. And that's the way people really should approach things, like UFOs or ghosts or whether it's Bigfoot or absolutely anything that people sort of put into this sort of school of thought. They should recognize that perhaps through science you could be able to comprehend it. And the same is true for anything about religion, especially when you're coming at it from the cosmic spiritual sense as described by Albert Einstein. You should always be aware that this is something that maybe through science you could understand it, which is what Sam Harris and Reza Aslan are all talking about. Jordan Peterson as well is talking about this very clearly, because Jordan Peterson was heavily inspired by Carl Jung, who also, came at it from that particular perspective. And Carl Jung was asked, like, does he believe in God? And his response was, it's not that I believe, I know. So it's like people are looking at this in the 21st century they're coming at spirituality from from a system that is not only rooted in belief, and they're sort of recognizing that there maybe is some sort of element associated with spirituality and this religious experience that Reza Aslan is writing about that actually is real. And that's all I can say about that for now. And I'll leave you with that. Well, what do you think? Do you think that supernatural is an appropriate term, or do you think that it is a misnomer and doesn't belong in the English language? And also, what do you think about any of the kind of arguments discussed in this podcast? If you have anything to say at all, please drop a comment below. And until next time.